The first time my family laughed after I lost my job, it happened in the middle of my nephew's 12th birthday dinner, with a sheet cake on the table, and 16 people close enough to hear my mother say, "Well, at least now Evelyn finally has time to answer her phone." A few people smiled because they thought she was joking. My brother Nolan did not. He leaned back in his chair, lifted his beer, and said, "No, Mom. Say it right. She doesn't have a job anymore. She has availability." There was a pause after that. Forks slowed. My nephew looked down at his plate. My sister-in-law gave the kind of tight laugh people use when they want to stand near cruelty without admitting they chose a side. My father kept cutting his chicken as if silence were a napkin he could fold over the table and make everything neat. I was still wearing the navy blouse I had worn to the termination meeting that morning. I had not gone home first. I had gone because my mother had called twice and said, "Don't make tonight about you. Your nephew only turns 12 once." So I had shown up with the wrapped gift still in the passenger seat beside the envelope from Human Resources. I put my glass down before it slipped in my hand. "You don't need to worry about my schedule," I said. It was the calmest sentence I could find. Not because I felt calm, because the room was already leaning toward spectacle, and I knew better than to feed one when my family was hungry for it. Nolan smiled across the table at me, in the indulgent way he had learned sometime in his 30s, the expression of a man who had begun mistaking volume for authority. "Oh, we're worried about more than your schedule," he said. "Mom told us they cut your whole division. That means severance, right? Which means you're fine for a while. Unless you already burned through that too." My mother turned to the others with a look that said, "See what I deal with." "She never plans for anything," she said. "That has always been Evelyn's problem. She thinks being smart will save her from being practical." I could feel the heat rising up my neck, but I kept my face still. Across from me, my daughter Lucy was quietly peeling the label from her water bottle with one thumbnail. She was 9. She had heard the call in the car when I pulled over after leaving the office. She had not cried. She had only asked, very softly, whether we still had our apartment. Children always go to the real question faster than adults do. "We are not discussing money at his birthday dinner," I said. That should have ended it. In a different family, it would have. Instead, my father set down his knife and finally looked at me. "Money is exactly what adults discuss when someone has made a mess," he said. "Especially when that someone has a child depending on her." The table shifted after that. Not outwardly. No one gasped. But there is a particular kind of social movement that happens when people realize a target has been chosen and begin adjusting themselves so the next blow does not land on them instead. Chairs stay where they are. Eyes do not. My mother reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone. "Actually," she said, "since we're all family here, maybe this is the best time. Nolan and Rebecca have been talking about expanding the house. The boys need another room. And with everything up in the air for you, maybe it's time to be realistic." I looked at her. "Realistic about what?" "About Birch Lane. That was my grandmother's house." She said it lightly, like she was mentioning a casserole dish someone had left behind at Christmas. But every person at that table knew what Birch Lane meant. My grandmother had died 18 months earlier. I had taken care of her through the last year of appointments, physical therapy, and the slow humiliations she would not let anyone else see. I had slept on her sofa 3 nights a week while Nolan visited twice and called it devotion. After she died, the house stayed in the family under a trust arrangement my grandmother had put in place before her stroke. It was supposed to be rented for a few years, then sold later, with the proceeds set aside for Lucy's education and for my cousin Mara's son, who had special medical needs. That had not been my mother's plan. My mother preferred plans that benefited the children who still obeyed her. My pulse slowed, which was how it always worked for me. The worse it got, the quieter I became. "What about Birch Lane?" I asked. Nolan stepped in before she could answer. "We're saying maybe the smartest thing now is to stop pretending it needs to sit there for some future fantasy." He spread his hands as if he were the reasonable one. "Lucy's 9. College is years away. You need stability now. We need the space now. Mom thinks the family should agree to transfer occupancy so we can move in by summer." For 1 second, no one spoke. Then Rebecca added, without looking at me, it would still be in the family. That was the line. That was the line people always used right before they took something and renamed the theft as continuity. Lucy had stopped peeling the label. She was staring at her plate so hard I knew she was trying not to look at me. I turned to my mother. "You brought this up tonight?" She shrugged. "When else? You're hard to reach lately." That almost made me laugh. For the past 2 weeks, since rumors of layoffs had started at my company, she had called every morning before 8 and every night after 9. If I did not answer, she left voicemails. If I texted that I was busy, she called again. At first I thought it was concern. Then the questions became strangely specific. Had I spoken to the trustee recently? Did I still have all the house paperwork? Was I still handling things alone? Did I think it was wise to keep so much responsibility in my own name when life was so unstable? I had noticed it. I just had not yet decided what it meant. Now, with 16 people around a birthday cake and my mother using my termination like a crowbar, I began to understand. My Aunt Denise cleared her throat and said, "Maybe this isn't the moment." Nolan turned toward her with a smile that showed all his teeth and none of his restraint. "It's exactly the moment. Everyone acts like Evelyn is some kind of martyr because she drove Grandma to chemo. That doesn't make her the only one allowed to make decisions." "She isn't the only one allowed," I said. "She's the one Grandma appointed." Silence again. Small silence. Important silence. My mother's hand tightened around her phone. "That paperwork was done before circumstances changed," she said. "What circumstances?" She looked straight at me when she answered. "Before you became unreliable." The room did not move this time. It froze. I heard the refrigerator motor hum from the kitchen. I heard a child in the backyard yell and then stop. I heard Lucy inhale. Unreliable. Not grieving. Not exhausted. Not recently unemployed. Unreliable. The word landed exactly where she meant it to. On my right to be trusted. On my right to decide. On my right to remain central to something I had held together when other people were too busy or too indifferent to help. I stood up, not fast, just enough to make my chair ease backward over the hardwood. "I'm taking Lucy home," I said. My mother gave a short, irritated laugh. "There it is. Drama." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up the gift I had brought for my nephew and set it beside his plate. "Happy birthday, Ben," he whispered. "Thanks, Aunt Ev." Without lifting his head. Lucy stood immediately. She did not need to be told twice. As I reached for my coat, my father said, "Running away won't solve anything." I turned back toward the table. "No," I said. "But staying while you test language around me might." Nolan's expression changed at that. Not because I had raised my voice. I had not. Because he heard the word test and knew I had heard more tonight than they intended. Nobody answered. That was fine. I did not need an answer yet. In the car, Lucy buckled herself in and stared out the window while the porch light behind us glowed yellow against the dark. Halfway down the block, she said, "Are they trying to take Grandma's house?" I kept my hands steady on the wheel. "I don't know yet," I said. That was the truth I could afford in front of her. When we got home, she went to brush her teeth without being asked. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the stack of unopened mail. The school calendar on the fridge. The single, clean lunch container drying by the sink. Nothing had exploded. No one was shouting. The apartment was quiet in the ordinary way that only hurts after someone has tried to move your life with words. Then my phone rang. "Mom." I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, Nolan called. Then my father. By 10:30 there were 6 missed calls and 2 voicemails. At 11 my mother texted, "Don't be childish. We're trying to help you before this gets worse." I read that message twice. Then I opened the fireproof box in the hall closet, took out the trust binder from Birch Lane, and saw that one tab near the back was no longer sitting where I had left it. Someone had already been inside it. I did not return any of their calls that night. After Lucy went to bed, I set the Birch Lane binder on the kitchen table and opened it the way I used to open internal audit files at work, slowly, without assuming the first thing missing would be the most important thing changed. The tax records were where I had left them. The insurance renewals were clipped in order. The maintenance receipts were still banded by year. But the amendment section had been handled. Not removed. Not damaged. Disturbed. One divider sat half an inch too far forward. A page near the back had been reinserted upside down, then corrected. That told me more than a missing document would have. Missing papers create panic. Touched papers create sequence. I sat down and read the trust again from the beginning. Birch Lane had been placed into a family trust 8 months before my grandmother's stroke. The property could not be sold, occupied, transferred, refinanced, or pledged without trustee approval and the administrator's sign-off. I was the acting trustee, not because I was the eldest grandchild, not because I was the favorite, because my grandmother had believed affection made people careless, and she trusted me to stay precise when everyone else became emotional. There was a clause I remembered helping her word after one of Nolan's early family use conversations. If any beneficiary attempted to pressure, influence, or manipulate access to the property for private benefit before the educational reserve obligations were satisfied, that beneficiary's occupancy claim could be suspended pending review. I stopped there. Then I understood why my mother had chosen a birthday dinner. She had wanted witnesses before resistance. She had wanted the family to hear a version of me before documents had a chance to answer for themselves. At 6:11 the next morning, my phone lit up with her name. I was already awake, packing Lucy's lunch. I watched the screen glow on the counter beside the bread knife. Then go dark. A text arrived immediately after. Call me back. We need to settle this quickly. At 6:18, Nolan called. At 6:26, my father. By 7, there were 2 more messages from my mother and 1 from Rebecca. We all got emotional last night. We all okay. Okay. At IN. Hey. IN. IN. Let's just be practical today. Practical. In my family, that word usually meant someone had already decided what would happen and was now asking me to cooperate with the conclusion. I dropped Lucy at school, waited until she disappeared through the glass doors, and listened to the voicemails in the parking lot. My father's was blunt. You need to stop turning this into conflict. If you're no longer in a position to manage Birch Lane responsibly, that has to be addressed. Nolan's was smoother, which made it worse. No one's attacking you, Ev. But one bad month can become a pattern fast. Mom's trying to keep things stable before you make this harder than it needs to be. My mother's was the only one I played twice. Listen carefully. If you keep holding on to responsibilities you can't realistically carry, people will have to step in. I'm trying to prevent that. Call me before I speak to anyone else. Before I speak to anyone else. Not if. Before. I called my former employer first, not because I thought the job was recoverable, but because I wanted the separation paperwork sent in full and time-stamped. Then I called the bank that held the trust reserve account and asked whether anyone had recently tried to obtain information without authority. The woman on the phone did not answer directly, but her pause was long enough to matter. There are recent notes on the file, she said. If you are the acting trustee, you may want to come in with identification. By 10:30, I was sitting across from a branch officer named Helen, with a printed access summary between us. She did not dramatize it. She did not need to. 3 separate inquiries had been logged in the previous 12 days. One from my mother, asking whether a parent of the acting trustee could receive updates because of employment instability and concerns about decision-making in the immediate household. One from Nolan, asking whether temporary family occupancy could be arranged in the best interests of the minor child connected to the trust. And one internal note confirming that both requests had been denied because neither had authority. I looked at the dates. The first inquiry had been made 3 days before I lost my job. That changed everything. Until then, the dinner could still have been read as opportunistic cruelty. A family seeing weakness and pushing too far. Ugly, but reactive. This was not reactive. They had started building the argument before my termination gave them the excuse. I asked Helen for copies of everything. She printed them, stamped them, and slid them into a sealed envelope without comment. Bank officers learn quickly that the most dangerous family stories are often told in the politest voices. I sat in my car afterward with the envelope on the passenger seat and did not start the engine. Outside, people moved through the lot carrying coffee, dry cleaning, groceries, normal lives. Nothing in the world had changed shape except mine. Then I opened the family thread I had muted months earlier. Mom, we need to be united right now. Nolan. Nobody wants this to get ugly. Rebecca. The boys already started talking about where their room would go. Mom. Evelyn. Silence is not maturity. I screenshotted all of it. At noon, my mother called again. This time I answered. She spoke first, brisk and composed. I was about to come over. I'm at the bank, I said. Pause. Then carefully. Good. Then maybe you're finally doing what needs to be done. No, I said. I'm documenting who contacted the trust office and how they described me. The silence that followed was short, but it was real. When she spoke again, the softness was gone. You are not going to make your family sound dangerous because you're embarrassed. You contacted the bank and raised concerns about my decision-making. That is not what I said. It's what they logged. She inhaled slowly. I could picture the expression on her face without seeing it. Chin lifted, mouth flattened, already preparing to recast the entire exchange as my distortion. You've always had a talent, she said, for turning concern into accusation. Concern usually doesn't begin with trying to create an incapacity record through third parties. Her voice dropped then, quiet enough to sound almost gentle. Be careful, Evelyn. With what? With isolation. People notice when someone stops functioning. That was the first moment she stopped pretending. Not comfort, not apology, not denial. A warning. I thought of Lucy in the back seat yesterday, asking whether we still had our apartment before asking whether I was okay. I thought of how quickly women are described as unstable when other people want access to what they manage. I thought of how often help is just pressure wearing a cardigan. I'm functioning fine, I said. Then prove it. She hung up. That evening, Lucy sat at the kitchen table doing her spelling packet while I made pasta. Nothing dramatic happened. Water boiled. Sauce thickened. The radiator clicked twice, but the room felt altered. As if someone had walked through our life and quietly tested which parts could be taken if they pushed hard enough. Halfway through her homework, Lucy asked, "Do I still have to go there on Sunday?" I looked over at her. To Grandma's? She nodded without lifting her pencil. You don't have to go anywhere that makes you uncomfortable, I said. She pressed harder on the page. Grandma asked if I liked Uncle Nolan's house better because it had a yard. I turned off the stove. When did she ask you that? Yesterday. When you were folding laundry. That settled the last piece. They were not just talking around me. They were talking through my daughter. I crossed back to the table and signed her field day permission form where she had left it open. She watched my hand move across the paper, then relaxed by a degree so small most people would have missed it. Ours is home, she said, not dramatically, not tearfully, just as a fact she needed to hear. Said aloud in the right room. Yes, I said. It is. After she went to brush her teeth, I called the trust administrator, Daniel Mercer, and asked for the earliest appointment he had. His assistant offered me the next afternoon. Then I reopened the binder one more time. This time I found a yellow sticky note tucked between the occupancy restriction and amendment pages. I did not use yellow notes. My initials were never written in block capitals. This one had only 2 words and a date. Temp auth. March 28. Today was April 17. Someone had not simply checked the documents. Someone had been looking for a way to turn pressure into permission for weeks. I slid the note into a plastic sleeve, photographed it, and added it to the folder with the bank log, the screenshots, and my phone records. By the time Nolan called that night, I already knew more than he realized. I answered on the 4th ring. He skipped a greeting. Mom says you're overreacting. She would. She's trying to keep this from getting ugly. It got ugly at Ben's birthday. He exhaled sharply. You keep hiding behind tone because you don't have a real answer. If you need money, say that. If you can't handle Birch Lane, say that. But don't drag this out because your pride got bruised. I let him finish. Then I said, I went to the bank today. The line went still. I know you and Mom both contacted them, I said. I know when you started. And I know it was before I lost my job. That proves nothing. No, I said. It proves sequence. He did not speak. Then he made the mistake I needed him to make. You lost your job, Evelyn. Things change. Not I'm sorry. Not you've had a hard month. Not we were worried. Things change. A condition. An opening. A shift in leverage. I looked toward Lucy's closed bedroom door. Then I said, very evenly, yes, they do. And I ended the call. By midnight, the calls had stopped. Not because they were done, because they had understood, finally, that I was no longer standing inside the version of the story they had prepared for me. By the time I sat down in Daniel Mercer's office the next afternoon, I had stopped thinking of what my family was doing as emotional pressure. Pressure was messy. This was organized. Daniel's office overlooked the courthouse lawn. He read the bank log once, then again, slower the second time. This isn't concern, he said. It's positioning. They're trying to create language around you before they try to move anything formal. I handed him the yellow sticky note from the binder. Tempoth, March 28. He studied it for a moment. They were looking for temporary authorization language. Occupancy, caretaker access, emergency use. Something they could frame as practical. That word again. Practical. I walked him through the dinner, the calls, the texts, and the questions my mother had asked Lucy. He took notes without interrupting. When I finished, he asked only one thing that mattered. Has anyone besides you tried to access the house? I don't know. Then that's where we start. He gave me a list. Utilities, insurer, vendors, property management, locksmith, places people call when they already think a house is theirs. When I left his office, I had not solved anything yet. But I had a sequence. And sequence turns suspicion into proof. The first call came before I reached the parking garage. It was the electric company returning an inquiry. A man identifying himself as Nolan Pierce had asked about keeping service active through a family move, so there would be no interruption when occupancy changed. I pulled over and wrote it down. The insurer had a similar note. Rebecca had called asking whether children moving into the house before summer would affect the policy. The lawn service had a voicemail from Nolan asking for a quote on regular upkeep. Once we're in, then the locksmith gave me the cleanest answer of all. A man called last week asking if we still had the key code from your rekey job, he said. We told him no. By then the pattern was unmistakable. Not one ugly dinner. Not one cruel suggestion. Movement. They were already speaking to companies as if Birch Lane had been handed over, and my objection was the only step left between plan and possession. That evening, Lucy sat at the kitchen table doing homework while I made soup. Nothing dramatic happened. Water boiled. She sharpened a pencil. Outside, a siren passed and faded. Then she asked, "Do I still have to go there on Sunday?" "To Grandma's?" I asked. She nodded. "No," I said. "You don't have to go anywhere that makes you uncomfortable." She kept looking at her worksheet. Grandma asked if I liked Uncle Nolan's house better because it has a yard. I turned off the stove. When? Yesterday. That settled the part of it I had still hoped was coincidence. They were not just building a story around me. They were building one through my daughter. The next morning, the property manager called me back. There had been a walk-through request 10 days earlier from Nolan. He had said he was coordinating a family transition and wanted a pre-occupancy readiness visit before the children moved in. The company refused because he was not the authorized contact, 10 days earlier. That was while I was still employed. While my mother was calling to ask if I was sleeping. While Nolan was texting like a supportive brother, I asked for the note in writing. The manager emailed it within the hour. Nolan's own line was included in the record. Trying to make this smooth before my sister's situation gets worse. I printed it immediately. That was the first hard proof. Not that they wanted the house. That they had already started acting as if I would be too weak to stop them. Daniel Mercer did not look surprised when he read Nolan's email to the property manager. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. He did not waste time reacting to proof that was already useful. He read the bank log, the vendor notes, the utility inquiry, and Nolan's line about making things smooth before my situation got worse. Then he placed the papers in a neat stack and said, "Now we separate behavior from authority." He drew 2 columns on his legal pad. What they are saying, what they can legally do. The second column stayed almost empty. That changed the air in the room. Until then, I had been following their calls, their language, their pressure, and their timing. But once Daniel laid the structure out plainly, their confidence started to look smaller. They were acting as if Birch Lane could be moved by family momentum. It could not. The house was not simply a sentimental family asset. It was trust-held property. That meant no beneficiary could move in because it felt practical. No parent could step in because they disliked the acting trustee's circumstances. And no sibling could build informal possession by calling vendors until the house began to look occupied in practice. Most important, no one could remove me from trustee authority without a formal process supported by real evidence. Losing my job was not that evidence. Neither was being pressured into looking distressed. Daniel walked me through the trust again, this time as strategy rather than memory. The educational reserve obligations came first. Birch Lane existed inside that structure, which meant the property was not available for private family use just because Nolan wanted more space, or my mother believed she could rename control as help. If they wanted amendment, they would need procedure, notice, administrative review, and clean hands. They no longer had clean hands. Then he began building the response. He sent formal notices to every institution my family had already touched. The bank, the insurer, the utility company, the property manager, and the locksmith. Each notice stated that Birch Lane remained under active trust administration, that I was the acting trustee, and that no third party had authority to request access, occupancy preparation, service transition, or representation of any kind. He also sent a preservation request instructing each company to retain all calls, account notes, voicemails, and internal records related to any recent inquiry. The effect was immediate. What had felt like pressure around me was now a documented interference pattern around the trust. Then Daniel asked a question I had not been expecting. Who has been paying the carrying costs? I told him the taxes and routine expenses had been paid through the trust reserve, and that I had personally covered part of a plumbing repair when the invoice came in higher than expected. He wrote that down. Then he asked who had coordinated my grandmother's treatment schedule, her medication management, and the maintenance of the house during the last year of her illness. I did, I said. He nodded once. He was not measuring affection. He was establishing competence, continuity, and the reason I held the records, the access, and the knowledge my family now wanted to convert into weakness. By the end of the meeting, his office had drafted a memorandum for the trust file, summarizing everything clearly enough that the situation no longer resembled a family disagreement. In legal language, it became what it actually was. Trust interference, unauthorized representation, pressure tied to a minor beneficiary's future, and a coordinated attempt to normalize occupancy before any lawful approval existed. Reading it was clarifying in a way anger had not been. The story looked very different once it was stripped of tone and put in order. By late afternoon, the confirmations started coming back. The bank flagged the file. The insurer restricted contact. The utility company froze service changes without trustee authorization. The property manager closed Nolan's inquiry as unauthorized. The locksmith added a permanent notation that no historical access information could be disclosed to anyone but me or counsel. A wall had gone up, and for the first time since the birthday dinner, they were no longer moving through open space. On my way to pick Lucy up from art class, I drove past Birch Lane. I had not planned to stop, but halfway down the block I saw Nolan's SUV parked near the curb. He was standing by the gate, phone in hand, looking at the front of the house with the focused impatience of someone inspecting a thing he already considered delayed, not denied. I parked 2 houses down and stayed where I was. He crossed to the front path, tested the gate latch, glanced at the side windows, and took several photos of the exterior. Then he tried to move farther down the side path, stopped at the updated lock, and stood there long enough for annoyance to show in the way he held his shoulders. I photographed him through the windshield, with timestamps visible, and called Daniel from the car. "He's at the house now," I said, checking access and taking pictures. "Do not confront him," Daniel said. "Send me the photos. Then call local patrol and ask for a documented non-emergency presence check. Not a complaint. A record. That distinction mattered. Panic wants a confrontation. Structure wants documentation." I made the call. By the time the officer arrived, Nolan had already left. But she logged the address, my trustee status, the concern about attempted unauthorized access, and the fact that counsel had instructed me to document any pre-occupancy activity. She gave me an incident reference number before she left. It was a small thing, but small things accumulate faster than people realize once the right file exists. When I picked Lucy up, she got into the car with paint on one sleeve and started telling me about a girl in class who mixed orange into every picture because she thought warm colors made things feel less lonely. I listened all the way home. The ordinary shape of her voice steadied me more than any legal memo could have. That night, while she worked through a math sheet at the kitchen table, I printed the incident note, the institutional confirmations, and Daniel's finalized directive for the trust file. Attached to it was the strongest line yet. Any attempted occupancy claim by a beneficiary would be suspended pending formal review because of active coercion concerns. I read that sentence twice. My family had tried to use my job loss as the moment my authority weakened. Instead, it had become the moment their access narrowed. At 8:07, my mother texted me. "I heard you involved a lawyer. This is becoming humiliating for everyone." I looked at the message for a long moment. Not wrong. Not unfair. Humiliating. That told me more than denial would have. A little later, my father left a voicemail asking what exactly I thought I was doing and warning that family matters did not end well once people formalized misunderstandings. I saved the message and forwarded it to Daniel with the incident number and Nolan's photos. His reply came back 10 minutes later. "Good. They're reacting to the wall." He was right. Until that point, my family had been relying on movement, tone, and speed. Now they were meeting structure instead. Birch Lane was no longer something they could edge toward through dinner table pressure and vendor calls. It had become what it had always been under the trust. A protected system with records, limits, and consequences. And once that became clear, the story changed. They were no longer trying to persuade me. They were trying to get around what they had already mishandled. The worst part was not that they wanted Birch Lane. It was that they had started building toward it while I was still trusting them. That truth did not arrive in one dramatic moment. It came together the way real betrayal usually does, through timing, phrasing, and small records that only become cruel once they are placed side by side. Daniel told me to build a full chronology, not just of the dinner and the calls after I lost my job, but of the weeks before it. He wanted overlap. Moments where support and strategy had occupied the same space. So I built it. My mother's sudden increase in daily calls. Nolan's new interest in helping with property logistics. Rebecca's casual questions about Birch Lane's bedrooms and yard. My father's comments about whether one person should really be carrying so much responsibility alone. The first layoff rumors at my company. Lucy's school paperwork. The bank inquiries. The vendor calls. Once those things sat in order, the moral break in the story stopped being vague. They had not turned on me because I lost my job. They had already been preparing. My job loss had only given them a cleaner excuse. I found the first clear piece in an old text thread with Rebecca. 2 months earlier, she had asked whether the upstairs bedroom at Birch Lane still had the built-in shelves and whether the back fence had ever been replaced. At the time, I had answered casually because the question sounded harmless. Almost domestic. Now they looked different. She had not been admiring the house. She had been assessing it. Then I remembered a call from Nolan 3 weeks before my termination. He had spent 15 minutes telling me how much I was carrying and how he could lighten the mental load by helping with vendors if Birch Lane needed anything before summer. At the time, I took it as performance, but mild performance. The kind families live around every day. Looking back, it was not an offer to support me. It was an attempt to enter the operating chain. The piece that hurt most involved Lucy. A month earlier, I had been sitting at the kitchen table filling out her school registration forms while my mother drank coffee across from me. Without looking at the papers, she asked, almost idly, if something changed suddenly, Nolan's address would still keep Lucy in a strong district, wouldn't it? I had answered without really hearing the danger in it. Nothing is changing suddenly, I told her. Now I understood what she had been doing. She was testing relocation language before there was any relocation to justify. That was how they worked. Not by saying the whole thing out loud. By laying sentences in advance. So that, later, the transition from suggestion to action would feel natural. Daniel said something to me that week I did not forget. Frequency can be used two ways, he said. As care, if the calls are answered. As evidence, if they're not. That made the daily calls after my termination look different. My mother had not been reaching out to comfort me. She had been building a record. Repeated attempts. Concern language. References to isolation. Comments about instability. Warnings that people might need to step in. If this ever became formal, they wanted to sound involved while making me sound unreachable. Even their texts fit the pattern once I reread them in order. We need to settle this quickly. People will have to step in. Silence is not maturity. Be careful with isolation. Prove it. None of it was comfort. It was narrative assembly. One night Lucy and I ate grocery store rotisserie chicken at the kitchen table because I was too tired to cook. She told me a boy in her class had hidden a glue stick in his desk and then acted surprised when the teacher found it later. Why would he do that? I asked. She shrugged. So he could say it was already there. I looked at her for a second longer than I meant to. Children sometimes explain adult behavior without knowing they have done it. Later, while I was rethreading one of her shoelaces, she asked, did Grandma know you lost your job before you told her? I looked up at once. Why would you ask that? Lucy twisted the hem of her shirt. Because when she called me, she said, your mom has always had trouble keeping things steady. She said it like she already practiced it. That was what made it unbearable. My mother had not simply insulted me in public or questioned me with institutions. She had rehearsed language about me so often that even Lucy could hear it as prepared. What did you say? I asked. Lucy looked down. I said you always keep things steady. I tied the second shoe more carefully than necessary. Thank you, I said. The clearest proof came from my email archive. I was searching for an old repair invoice when I found a message from the month my grandmother died. It was part of a thread about memorial catering, and my mother had accidentally copied me on a forward to Nolan before covering it with another message. I had barely noticed it then. Grief makes people miss sharp things unless they arrive with noise. The forwarded line said, Evelyn will keep doing the practical work if she thinks it protects Lucy. Don't push yet. I read it twice. Then once more. That message had been sent 18 months earlier. Before the trust was fully settled. Before the tenants. Before the repair cycle. Before my termination. Before the birthday dinner. Before the daily calls. The strategy had existed long before the excuse. I forwarded the email to Daniel. He called me within 10 minutes. This matters, he said. Not because it's dramatic, because it proves intent and timing. They understood exactly how you would keep carrying things, and they were already discussing when to apply pressure. That was the moral reveal. They had not simply seen weakness and moved toward it. They had studied my strengths, my reliability, my protectiveness, my habit of holding systems together, and treated those strengths as the mechanism by which I could be displaced. The next morning my Aunt Denise called. Her voice was hesitant in a way I had never heard from her before. I need to tell you something, she said. About a month ago, your mother told me Nolan might move into Birch Lane if things became unstable for you. I thought she meant if you chose to relocate after the layoffs. I didn't understand she meant this. I closed my eyes. Did she say when she started thinking that? Denise exhaled. She said, you know Evelyn. She'll hold on too long unless someone makes the practical choice for her. Practical again. Their favorite word whenever they wanted control to sound responsible. After we hung up, I wrote down everything Denise remembered and added it to the file. By then the pattern was complete enough to be sickening. The house was not the whole story. The deeper plan was role replacement. They wanted to turn me from trustee into instability, from mother into question mark, from protector into obstacle. Birch Lane was simply the object through which they thought they could make that change look reasonable. That afternoon, Rebecca texted me. "The boys are confused. They thought summer might look different." I read it once and put the phone face down. It was not an apology. It was not correction. It was another attempt to make children absorb the emotional cost of a plan adults had no right to make. I added that text to the file too. By the end of that week, I understood something I had not understood at the birthday dinner. My family had not depended on me because they respected me. They had depended on me because I was useful, and they assumed usefulness would keep me compliant longer than it kept me protected. Once I saw that clearly, something in me changed. Not my anger, my threshold. They moved faster once the wall went up. That was the part Daniel had predicted. People who fail quietly often retreat. People who believe they are entitled usually escalate. The first move came through family, because my mother still trusted rooms more than records. She began calling relatives I had not spoken to in months, telling them I was spiraling and had become paranoid since the layoff. She did not accuse me of anything concrete. She was too practiced for that. Instead, she used softer language, the kind meant to travel farther because it sounds compassionate while doing damage. "She's not herself right now. I'm worried about the pressure she's under. She's becoming very hard to reason with. I just don't want Lucy caught in the middle." By Friday afternoon, 2 cousins had texted me versions of the same careful message. "Hey, just checking in. Heard things have been intense." That was how I knew the campaign had widened. Not because anyone confronted me directly, but because concern had started arriving pre-shaped. Then Nolan made it public. He posted a photo of Birch Lane on Facebook just after 6 that evening. It was an old spring picture from years ago, taken when my grandmother still kept flower boxes under the front windows. The caption read, "Some homes are meant to stay with the family," hoping to bring this place back to life for the next generation. No names, no direct claim. Nothing I could report as false in one simple sentence. But the comments told me exactly what he intended. "Beautiful. Your boys would love that yard. So glad it's staying in the family. Your grandmother would be happy to see this. Proud of you for stepping up." Stepping up. That was the phrase people always use when someone takes a thing they were never asked to carry. I took screenshots before he could edit anything and sent them to Daniel. He replied within minutes. "Don't respond. Let him keep creating discoverable intent." I followed his advice, but the post did what it was designed to do. By that night, my mother was texting me as if public assumption had already become private fact. "You are making this harder than it needs to be. People are trying to support continuity. Don't force this into something ugly." I did not answer. Instead, I made dinner for Lucy and listened to her explain why one of her classmates thought clouds should always be purple in drawings because white clouds looked unfinished. She was talking with total seriousness, her fork moving mashed potatoes around in small circles, and I was struck by how much effort ordinary life requires when someone is trying to drag your home into a story it does not belong in. After dinner, she asked if she could sleep with the hallway light on. "Of course," I said. She hesitated, then added, "If Grandma calls, I don't want to talk tonight." That was the emotional cost of escalation. Not fear in the dramatic sense. Avoidance. Fatigue. A child learning that some people do not enter a room but still change its temperature. The next morning, the escalation became procedural. Daniel's office received a letter from a lawyer I did not recognize, representing Nolan and Rebecca in connection with a proposed family occupancy transition discussion. The wording was polished enough to look respectable at first glance, and dishonest enough to be useful only if no one checked the structure underneath it. The letter claimed that my recent unemployment had materially changed the practical realities surrounding Birch Lane, and suggested that temporary intra-family occupancy would protect the property, preserve continuity, and create stability for all minors affected. For all minors affected. That phrase was doing far too much work. Lucy was not being protected by losing the structure meant to secure her future. Nolan's sons were not beneficiaries whose needs outranked the trust. But the letter was not written to be correct. It was written to make overreach sound balanced. Daniel forwarded it to me with one sentence attached. They've decided to turn pressure into paper. I went to his office that afternoon. He had already marked the letter in red. No authority cited, he said. No legal basis for emergency occupancy. No recognition of the existing coercion flag. They're hoping volume and tone will make this feel legitimate. What do we do? We answer once, cleanly. He drafted a response while I sat across from him. It stated that Birch Lane remained under protected trust administration, that no beneficiary had occupancy rights at present, that any attempt to create possession through informal transition language would be treated as interference, and that recent documented conduct by Nolan, Rebecca, and my mother had already been placed in the file as evidence of coordinated pressure. It also included a direct warning. Any further unauthorized representation to vendors, institutions, or third parties would be preserved for formal action. No anger, no flourish, just structure. That should have slowed them. Instead, it cornered them into the thing people like that always do when private control starts failing. They tried to make me look unstable in front of witnesses. It happened on Sunday after church at my mother's house. I had not planned to go, but my Aunt Denise called that morning and said quietly, "You should come today. I think they're setting something up." So I went. The house was full when I arrived. My parents were in the kitchen, Nolan and Rebecca were in the den, 3 cousins were on the back patio, and my Uncle Howard was standing by the coffee station stirring sugar into a paper cup, as if every family crisis should begin with the right level of sweetness. The moment I walked in, I felt it. Not tension, arrangement. Too many people already present. Too much quiet when I entered. Too much interest in whether I had come alone. Lucy was with a friend's family for the afternoon. That was the only reason I stayed. My mother greeted me with false warmth and touched my elbow as if we were recovering from some private misunderstanding, instead of standing in the middle of a staged intervention. "I'm glad you came," she said. "We all thought it might help to talk together." There it was. Not a visit. Not lunch. Not family time. A managed conversation. I looked around the room. Nolan did not meet my eyes at first. Rebecca did, but only briefly. With the thin, careful expression of someone trying to appear compassionate while waiting for a result she already wants. My father stood near the dining room doorway with both hands in his pockets and his jaw set in that rigid line he used when he planned to call something reasonable until everyone else got tired. Denise came to stand near me without making it obvious. My mother guided everyone into the living room. She stayed standing while the rest of us sat, which told me more than anything she said next. "We're here because things have become concerning," she began. No one interrupted her. She spoke in a slow, measured voice. The voice of a woman who wanted to sound reluctant, while finally saying what had to be said. She mentioned the layoff. My withdrawal. My use of lawyers. My refusal to work with the family. Then she moved. Exactly as I knew she would. From behavior to child. "We are especially worried about Lucy," she said. That was when Nolan stepped in. "We think there should be a temporary pause on all Birch Lane decisions until Evelyn gets some perspective," he said. "Nobody's trying to take anything. But right now she's making choices from fear, not judgment." A cousin shifted in his chair. My Uncle Howard looked down at his cup. No one agreed aloud, but no one stopped him either. That was the purpose of the room. Not to prove something. To let it hang long enough that silence could be mistaken for consensus. I kept my hands still in my lap. My father spoke next. "No one is attacking you. But when someone loses work, isolates, brings in legal threats, and starts seeing enemies everywhere, family has an obligation to intervene before real damage is done." Intervene. That word had finally arrived in public. Not concern, not continuity, not practicality. Intervene. I looked from him to my mother and understood the stage they were trying to build. If I got angry, I would confirm instability. If I cried, I would confirm fragility. If I walked out, they would call it avoidance. The room had been designed to produce a reaction and then use that reaction as proof. So I gave them none. Instead, I reached into my bag and took out Daniel's latest response letter. The trust directive suspending any beneficiary occupancy claim, pending review, and the documented list of unauthorized contacts made by Nolan and Rebecca to vendors and service providers. Then I placed the papers on the coffee table, one on top of the other, and said, very evenly, "You're not here to help me. You're here because your informal attempts failed." The room changed. Not loudly. But enough. My mother's face tightened. Nolan leaned forward at once. "That is not what this is." I slid the vendor log toward him. "Electric transfer inquiry," I said. "Insurance occupancy question. Lawn service setup. Property walkthrough request. Locksmith access attempt. All before any lawful approval existed." Rebecca's expression broke first. Only for a second, but I saw it. My father started to speak, but I continued before he could reset the room. "You asked institutions to treat me as unstable," I said, looking at my mother now. "You asked my daughter whether she preferred another house. You discussed moving into trust property before my job was even gone. And now you've gathered witnesses so you can call that concern." Denise said quietly. "That's true." It was the first open fracture. My mother turned toward her in disbelief. "Excuse me? You told me last month Nolan might move in if things became unstable for Evelyn," Denise said. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "I thought you meant if she asked for help." "You didn't." The room went still. Nolan looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked down. My father's voice hardened. "Denise, you don't understand the full picture." But that was the problem for them now. The full picture had finally started answering back. My father said Denise did not understand the full picture. But by then the room had already begun to shift in the one way families never recover from quickly. Not toward truth. Toward doubt. That was enough. Until that afternoon, my mother had been controlling the emotional temperature. She had gathered the room, chosen the framing, and relied on the familiar hierarchy that had protected her for years. "She spoke first," my father reinforced. Nolan translated entitlement into practicality, and everyone else stayed still long enough for stillness to look like agreement. But now the stillness had changed shape. My Uncle Howard set his coffee down without drinking it. One of my cousins stopped pretending to scroll through her phone. Denise stayed where she was beside me, instead of retreating the moment my father challenged her. Even Rebecca, who had spent weeks smoothing over Nolan's ambition with soft language, had gone visibly quiet. My mother felt it too. I could tell by the way she straightened her shoulders before she spoke. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, turning not to me but to the room. "A simple family conversation becomes a legal performance because Evelyn cannot tolerate anyone questioning her decisions." That was a good line. Clean. Familiar. Built to put me back in the role of the difficult daughter, and put everyone else back in the safer role of patient observer. It might even have worked if the documents were not still lying on the coffee table between us. Nolan leaned forward and tapped one page, as if proximity could weaken it. "You're making normal planning look sinister. We asked questions. That's all. No one moved into the house. No one took anything." He should not have said that. Because the moment he reduced everything to questions, he made the evidence easier to read aloud. I picked up the property manager's email first. "You requested a pre-occupancy walkthrough," I said. "Not a question. A readiness visit before the children moved in." Then I lifted the utility note. "You asked about keeping electrical service continuous through a family move." Then the insurer's call log. "Rebecca asked whether children moving in before summer would affect coverage." I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I let each item sit long enough for the room to absorb that this was not my interpretation. It was their own language, reflected back without heat. My cousin Leah held out her hand. "Can I see that?" I gave her the utility note. She read it, then passed it to her husband without comment. That was the second fracture. In families like mine, truth rarely arrives through morality first. It arrives through embarrassment. Someone touches the actual paper, and suddenly a private performance becomes harder to maintain. My father tried to pull the room back under him. "You still haven't proved malicious intent," he said. "At worst, your brother got ahead of himself because he thought the family needed a practical solution." Practical again. The word had done a lot of work for them over the last month. It had helped them sound sensible while trying to reposition a child's future as spare housing for my brother. I reached into my bag and took out the forwarded email from my mother, the one she had sent to Nolan 18 months earlier and accidentally copied me on. I unfolded it carefully. This was sent the month Grandma died, I said. For the first time that afternoon, my mother's face changed before I finished the sentence. Not outrage. Recognition. I read the line aloud. Evelyn will keep doing the practical work if she thinks it protects Lucy. Don't push yet. No one moved. The sentence entered the room and stayed there. Nolan's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Rebecca looked at him. Not at me. My father's eyes went to my mother for one quick, involuntary second, which told me even he had not known exactly how old the strategy was. My Aunt Denise sat down very slowly. Leah said, "Wait. What?" I handed her the printed email. She read it twice. Then she looked up. Not at me, but at my mother. "You were talking about timing this that far back?" My mother did what she always did when caught too clearly. She tried to move upward into tone. "That email is being twisted," she said sharply. "Your grandmother had just died. Everyone was under pressure. We were discussing how to keep things stable." "For who?" Denise asked. It was the first time anyone in that family had spoken to my mother that way in years. Not louder than her. Cleaner than her. My mother blinked. Nolan stepped in too quickly. "This is insane. Ev, you saved an old family email and now you're acting like that proves some long-term conspiracy?" I turned to him. "No. Your vendor calls proved that. The bank log proved that. The property request proved that. The email proves you weren't improvising." That was when Rebecca finally made the mistake I had been waiting for. She looked straight at Nolan and said, too softly, but not softly enough, "I told you we shouldn't have called the insurance company yet." The room froze. Some lines do not need to be loud. They only need to exist. Nolan turned toward her with such immediate anger that he forgot there were witnesses. "That's not what this is about." But it was too late. A sentence like that does not create suspicion. It confirms sequence. My Uncle Howard leaned back and let out one sharp breath through his nose. "You called the insurance company?" Rebecca said nothing. Leah was still holding the email. "And the utilities? And the property manager?" No one answered. That was the moment the narrative broke. Not because I had made a speech. Not because anyone apologized. Because for the first time, the people in the room were no longer being asked to choose sides based on loyalty. They were being forced to choose whether to ignore documents in their own hands. My father tried once more. "All of this still ignores the central issue," he said. "Evelyn lost her job. Her circumstances changed. The family had every right to ask whether she could still manage a complicated asset responsibly." "No," Daniel said from the doorway. Every head turned. I had not invited him inside. I had only asked him, an hour earlier, whether he could be available nearby, if the meeting became what I suspected it would. Denise must have let him in when things turned. He stepped into the room with a slim folder in one hand and the calm expression of a man who did not care whose house it was because structure traveled with him. "The family had no right," he said evenly, "to attempt unauthorized access, representation, or occupancy preparation while simultaneously laying language to weaken the acting trustee's standing. And for the record, Mr. Pierce, Miss Pierce and Mrs. Hart have all now generated enough documented conduct that any future review of trustee authority would likely reflect far more poorly on them than on my client." My mother stood up at once. "This is outrageous. You do not come into my home." He did not raise his voice. "I'm here because your family appears to have mistaken private pressure for legal process." That sentence landed harder than anything I had said all afternoon. Because it did not sound emotional. It sounded final. Daniel placed one more document on the coffee table. It was the temporary protective directive under the trust administration process. The one suspending any beneficiary occupancy claim pending review because of active coercion concerns. Leah read the heading first. Howard leaned over and read the rest. Then Howard looked directly at Nolan and said, "So you can't move in?" "Not can't yet. Not this got messy. Can't. Nolan flushed so visibly that even my mother could not drag the conversation back to abstract concern. This is temporary, he said. You're all acting like she won some kind of war. No, Denise said quietly. She just stopped you. That was the third fracture. And the one that mattered most. Because once another family member names the thing correctly, everyone else hears their own silence differently. My mother looked around the room and saw what I saw. No one was with her in the way they had been 40 minutes earlier. No one was rushing to comfort her. No one was nodding along. Even the cousins who wanted no part of the conflict were now avoiding her eyes instead of mine. Social collapse is rarely dramatic at first. It sounds like people no longer volunteering for your version. Rebecca stood up and said she thought they should go. Nolan did not move. My father told Daniel the family would be discussing this further through proper channels. Daniel answered, "That would be advisable." My mother turned to me then, and for one brief second all the performance dropped away. What remained was not grief, not concern, not righteous anger. It was humiliation. Not because she had been publicly insulted. Because she had lost control of the frame. Lucy was not there to see it, and I was grateful for that. But the people who had mattered in the room had seen enough. They had seen my mother's old email. They had heard Rebecca confirm the insurance call. They had watched Nolan deny conduct already sitting in print. They had heard a trust lawyer say plainly that the family had no right to do what they had been trying to do. Nothing after that could be restored to misunderstanding. I gathered my documents slowly, one page at a time. No one tried to stop me. No one asked me to stay. No one told me I was overreacting. As I stood, Leah handed me back the email and said, almost under her breath, "I didn't know." "I know," I said. Denise squeezed my forearm once. Howard looked at Nolan and then away from him, which in my family was the closest thing to open condemnation most men ever offered. I left without another word. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wet grass, and someone's barbecue 2 houses down. I sat in my car for a moment with the documents in my lap and let the quiet settle. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Lucy's friend's mother. "She's fine. They're making bracelets and asking for ice cream later." I looked at that message for a long moment. Inside one house, a narrative had just collapsed in front of witnesses. Inside another, my daughter was making bracelets. That was the whole point. By the time I got home that night, the shift had already begun spreading without me touching it. Leah texted first. "I'm sorry. I should have asked questions sooner." Then Howard. "If anyone asks, I saw the documents." Then, an hour later, Denise. "Your mother called me." I didn't answer. All 3 messages meant the same thing. The room had broken in the right direction. And once witnesses begin preserving their own distance from the lie, collapse stops being private. The calls did not stop immediately after Sunday, but they changed. That was enough. Before, my mother had called like someone confident that access still belonged to her. After the meeting, every message sounded narrower, more careful, more aware that anything sent could be saved and anything said could be repeated by someone who had been in the room. My father left one voicemail the next morning. He said the family was regrettably divided, and that it would be best if everyone took a few days before making anything more formal than necessary. Nolan sent nothing at all. Rebecca texted once to say, "We never wanted this to become public." I did not answer any of them. There was nothing left to negotiate. The structure had already spoken. On Tuesday, Daniel forwarded me a short email from the lawyer Nolan had hired. The tone was very different from the first letter. There was no more language about continuity, practical solutions, or protecting minors. The new message stated that his clients would not be pursuing any occupancy discussion at this time and reserved all rights regarding future beneficiary review. Daniel's note above it was only one sentence. "They've stepped back because they know the file got too expensive." That was the financial collapse, though no one announced it as such. Nolan had spent money on a lawyer to create movement, and now that movement had closed around him instead. Every vendor call, every unauthorized inquiry, every staged concern had become something billable, preservable, and potentially damaging. The house he had been measuring in his mind had turned into cost. 2 days later, the property manager told me Nolan had tried once more to call the office and then ended the conversation as soon as he was reminded that all inquiries were being retained for counsel. The insurer reported no further contact. The utility company marked the file quiet. Even the lawn service stopped receiving family transition messages. What disappeared first was not their desire. It was their confidence. That same week, my Aunt Denise asked if she could stop by in the evening. She came after dinner carrying a lemon loaf from the grocery store and stood in my kitchen looking older than she had the Sunday before. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "You did say something," I answered. "Late." She was right. But I did not need her to suffer for me to recognize the value of what she had done. We cut the loaf into thick, uneven slices because Lucy liked the end pieces, and the three of us sat at the table while the dishwasher ran. Nothing explosive happened. Denise asked Lucy about school. Lucy described a relay game in gym class and the unfairness of pairing fast kids with other fast kids. Denise laughed once, then went quiet. Before leaving, she touched my shoulder and said, "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing." After she left, Lucy helped wrap the extra cake in foil. "Is Aunt Denise still family?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She nodded as if she had been sorting people internally and wanted to make sure one pile was still intact. That was the emotional shift. Not a speech, not a grand reunion, just a child beginning to see that truth changes where trust belongs. On Friday afternoon, I drove to Birch Lane with Daniel's final updated directive in my bag and the new access record from the security company on the passenger seat. The house looked the same from the outside. White trim, narrow porch. The front steps still slightly darker where rain always settled near the rail. But once I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the quiet felt different. Not hollow. Settled. The entry table still held the small ceramic dish my grandmother used for keys. The air carried the faint dry scent of wood and old lemon oil. I stood in the foyer for a long moment and did not think about my mother, or Nolan, or the room at Sunday's meeting. I thought about the trust clause my grandmother had insisted on. The one everyone else had treated as unnecessary because they still believed family goodwill could do the work of structure. She had known better. I walked room to room with the updated file in hand and checked what needed checking. The back windows, the utility panel, the lock report, the insurance inventory note. Simple things. Practical things, in the real sense of the word. Not a disguise for taking. Just the quiet labor required to keep something protected. In the upstairs bedroom, I found the built-in shelves Rebecca had asked about months earlier. They were still painted the same pale cream, still bowed slightly in the middle where time had pulled at the wood. I ran my fingers along the edge and thought about how closely some people study a thing they have already decided should become theirs. Then I closed the room and moved on. That evening, Lucy asked if she could come with me the next time I went to Birch Lane. "Just for a little while," she said. "I want to see if it still smells the same." So on Sunday afternoon we went together. She walked in quietly, not like a child visiting a new place, but like someone returning to a sentence interrupted in the middle. In the kitchen, she opened the silverware drawer and smiled because the spoons were still where they had always been. In the living room, she sat on the window seat for a minute without speaking. Then she said, "It still feels like hers." "Yes," I said. That was the legacy piece, though I did not name it aloud. Birch Lane was never just a property. It held my grandmother's judgment, her protection, and the part of her love that trusted design more than promises. My family had tried to turn that into spare space for my brother's children and a convenient story about my instability. But the house had not changed meaning simply because they had wanted it to. If anything, it meant more now, because what it protected had become clearer. Lucy wandered into the hallway and called back. "Can I bring my books here sometime?" I looked at her standing there in the late afternoon light, one hand resting on the banister, completely untheatrical in her hope. "Yes," I said. "You can." On the drive home, she fell asleep in the back seat with one shoe half off and her forehead tipped against the window. I drove slowly through our neighborhood after that, giving the quiet a little more time. When I checked my phone later that night, there was one unread email from my mother. It was shorter than her usual messages. I never wanted outsiders involved in this. I hope someday you understand that everything I did was for the family. I read it once and archived it. There was nothing left to decode. She still believed family meant the version of order where she chose the center and everyone else adjusted around it. I no longer needed to argue with that belief. The trust had answered her. The witnesses had answered her. Even her own silence in the days since had answered her. By the following week, the social lines had settled into their new shape. Denise stayed in touch. Leah sent Lucy a book and a short note that simply said, "Thinking of you." Howard did not call, but he also did not repeat my parents' language to anyone else, which in our family counted as a declaration. Nolan remained quiet. Rebecca disappeared with him. My father sent one final message about letting time do its work. Time already had. One Thursday evening, nearly a month after the birthday dinner, I came home from picking Lucy up from school and found the apartment exactly as I had left it that morning. Lunch container drying by the sink, her spelling words still clipped to the fridge. The soft lamp near the sofa already glowing because I had put it on a timer. Nothing dramatic. Nothing triumphant. Just our life. Lucy dropped her backpack by the door and asked what was for dinner. "Tomato soup and grilled cheese," I said. "Good," she answered, and went to wash her hands. I stood alone in the kitchen for a moment after that, and let the stillness settle around me. Not the old stillness, the one that used to follow accusation. A different one, the kind that arrives when no explanation is owed anymore. They had tried to recast me as unstable, replaceable, and temporary. But I had not been the unstable part. I had not been the temporary part. And I had never been the thing holding on too long. I had been the structure they were hoping would loosen. It didn't. Later that night, after Lucy was asleep, I opened the fireproof box in the hall closet and placed the newest trust directive behind the original one. Then I closed the lid and returned it to the shelf. That was all. No speech. No victory call. No final argument. Just the sound of protection being put back where it belonged.